Well, he's finally done it. Bart Ehrman has finally made the case that Jesus never claims to be God. Or has he? Join us on All Rise to find out.
All right. Well, all rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's me, once again, Derek Caldwell, with author and speaker Abdu Murray. How you doing, Abdu?
Doing great, Derek.
Yeah, I'm starting with high energy today.
Yeah, you are. Big energy, man. I'm impressed.
It's almost lying on camera because I'm so tired, but I'm happy to be here. Long weekend. I baptized my nephew. I did his wedding ceremony, so I'm it was a big weekend. And,
wow, you did some real ministry, man.
Yeah, I did a lot, but
I'm proud of you.
And today, as you heard at the top of the show, we are responding once again to some claims that Bart Ehrman made, and I'll be honest, sometimes it does hurt because when I watch these videos, he seems like such a pleasant man. Mm-hmm. And when you feel like you only ever have critical remarks for someone, it's not I'm not built like that to just criticize, but he does seem like such a pleasant man. But he's saying some things, and what he's saying is very popular, so it requires a Christian response.
Well, yeah, and that's the part that's important for us. We're trying not to just be critical. We offer a reason for the hope we have, and we do this with gentleness and with respect. But the reality is that scholars, being scholars, they put their work out there to be criticized and to be critiqued, sometimes encouraged or lauded when necessary. But because the things he does say, in a very pleasant way, happen to have a pretty serious impact on people's faith. Skeptics who are considering the Christian faith might look at his stuff and say, hey, maybe I shouldn't after all. And it's the kind of thing it packs a punch, and therefore it's worthy of a response. So, yeah, we tend to have him on only in the sense of criticizing what he has to say. But what he has to say is the kind of thing that is worthy of response.
Yeah, and, we by the time this comes out, people will have already seen that we had an episode responding to some comments from Rhett McLaughlin talking about authority.
Yeah.
And how can I disagree with something these scholars are saying, because they're the authorities. They must know more than me. They spent the years doing the study. And you can make the case that, and I've heard people say that too about Bart Ehrman. He's this preeminent scholar. Who am I to disagree with what he's saying about Jesus? And one of the things that you pointed out is that, hey, there are actually other scholars who have bona fides, who are doing this work, doing the hard work, and really swimming in this. This is their life, and they're saying other things. They have very good reasons for what they're saying. And today, we have the pleasure of being joined by one of those preeminent major scholars in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. We have my friend Rob Bowman on the show with us today. We are excited to have him on. Rob is an apologist, biblical scholar, an author, an editor, lecturer. He's the president of IRR, which is the Institute for Religious Research, and you can find out more about what Rob does at irr.org. Rob holds an MA and a PhD in biblical studies from Fuller Theological Seminary and South African Theological Seminary. Rob's a prolific author. He's authored over 60 articles and authored or co-authored 15 books, including some of my favorites, Jesus' Resurrection and Joseph's Visions, Examining the Foundations of Christianity and Mormonism, Putting Jesus in His Place, which, by the way, we talked with Rob about this before the show, and the reality is, as someone who was, by the way, I used to be, as a Muslim, so you know this, I used to deny the fact that Jesus was God and thought that the Bible didn't even teach this. So I used to be sympathetic to Bart Ehrman's arguments, but Putting Jesus in His Place, which is a book I discovered after I came to faith, but one that really shored up the things I've come to believe, is a book everyone should be reading.
It's a modern Christian classic, I think we could safely say.
I think it's safe to say that.
Yeah, I think it's safe.
And if it wasn't safe to say it, I'd take the risk anyway. Yeah. Putting Jesus in His Place.
You live so dangerously, Rob.
The Case for the Deity of Christ. He's co-authored that with another good friend of ours, Ed Komoszewski, and Faith Has Its Reasons, co-authored with another good guy, Dr. Ken Boa.
Yeah.
Rob, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Rob,
thanks for those nice things you said.
You bet. Well deserved, by the way.
Yeah. No, you don't have to do any self-promotion here. We'll do it.
We'll do it for you.
We'll do it for you because we love your work so much.
Yeah, we do. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and we talked about this a little bit before we got on, was you're working on something. Well, working on it is a technical term because you're done with the work. You and Ed are done with the work on an exciting project that I really want people to know about, very much related to the topic we're speaking about today. So tell us a little bit about the thing that's forthcoming.
Yes, forthcoming, estimated to be coming out in May of 2024, is a new book on the same subject as the one that you mentioned, Putting Jesus in His Place. This book is over twice as long as that book. It is a much more extensive, detailed, and comprehensive defense of the deity of Christ. It's called The Incarnate Christ and His Critics, a Biblical Defense. And the reference to his critics is referring to the fact that the book systematically responds to a variety of unorthodox and non-Christian views of Jesus and their attempts to defend their views by engaging the New Testament. Skeptics are involved. In fact, Bart Ehrman, we're going to talk about him. He happens to be the leading example that we use throughout the book of a skeptic's approach to Christology, the study of Christ. We look at Islam, we look at Unitarianism, we look at what's called progressive Christianity, which is kind of a different kind of liberal Christianity. We look at Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Oneness Pentecostals. And we look at how all of these different groups interpret the New Testament, how they understand who Jesus Christ is based on the way they interpret the New Testament. And we contrast that with the traditional Orthodox understanding of Christ as God the Son incarnate. And so that's what the book is. It's, as I said, it's rather long, but it's not hard to read because it's written with the layperson in mind. So it explains things for people that are interested, but maybe don't have the technical background you would get in seminary or something like that. I'm really excited about the book. It took a long time to put it together. The book is about 4 years in the making, but I think it's going to be worth it. And as I mentioned, a particular relevance to our conversation today, it specifically engages arguments used by Bart Ehrman on this subject of what Jesus thought about himself, what he said about himself, and whether there's any reason to think that Jesus actually claimed to be divine.
Mm, yeah. Excellent. Well, it occurs to me that I don't want to commit you to something on our channel necessarily, but when that book comes out, it would be a tremendous honor to have you and Ed on the show at the same time. I think it would be a wonderful interview. So give it some thought. You have some time to think about it, Rob, but we'd love to have you back.
We'll see how this one goes first.
That's some good thinking right there. That's some good thinking right there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so what do we have in store?
Yeah. So we've got, there was recently an interview of Bart Ehrman with Alex O'Connor, who was known as the Cosmic Skeptic. Cosmic Skeptic. And anyway, very influential channel, and like everything Bart does, very influential, gets a wide viewing or a wide reading as a word. But in this case, it's an interview that I listened to and was just kind of fascinated by some of the claims that he made. And he's clearly keeping up with some of the apologetic responses because he is responding to some of those too. So we're basically just going to be playing some of those clips today for you all, and then we're going to respond to those. But we're not going to paraphrase what he said. We're not going to misconstrue or create a straw man. You're going to hear it directly from Dr. Ehrman, and then Dr. Bowman and Abdu and myself will be responding. So let's go ahead and get started. And this video is titled "Jesus Never Claimed to Be God," so you kind of know precisely what he's getting at from the, it's a little on the nose, but that's good.
Let's hear it.
If you look at all of that material, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Q, M, and L, okay, all of that together, Jesus never calls himself God. All of our earliest sources, where Jesus starts calling himself God is the Gospel of John, our last source. And so, to my thinking, you have these sources of information about Jesus. So I've just laid out six sources, 6 pieces of information versus 1. The 6 are all earlier than the one. It seems to me completely implausible that 6 authors would describe the sayings of Jesus knowing that he called himself God and neglect to mention that part. Like that bit just isn't important enough to bring up. So I think it's completely implausible.
What kind of passages are we talking about that people generally point to in the synoptic gospels, in the earlier sources, that say, well, Jesus seems to be implying he's God? Because of course people will want to say that, okay, maybe Jesus wasn't walking around saying that he was God.
Yeah.
But maybe doing so wouldn't have been a particularly great strategy.
Yeah.
Maybe in order to have enough time to have his message understood by his early followers and to sort of conduct his ministry before eventually being killed, if he just immediately started claiming to be God, he'd just be killed straight away. And so what he needs to do is get the message across, get the important moral teachings, which are the sort of most important part of his ministry, and then allow future generations after he died to realize the truth. Yeah, no,
that would be a plausible way to argue. I'm not convinced by it. It's what I used to argue when I was an evangelical Christian, and so I'm familiar with it. You'd have to say that the Gospel of John's wrong then, because in the Gospel of John, he does claim divinity early in the ministry and throughout the ministry.
All right. So there he's essentially saying Jesus never, as the title says, Jesus never claimed to be God. In the synoptic gospels, when he's talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he mentions some other things, Q, M, and L. We don't necessarily need to get into that, but he's essentially saying the synoptic gospels. So one of the first questions we want to talk about is that true? And in what ways did Jesus identify as divine in the synoptics? But a second question to that will be what he brings up, which is a good point. If we say that, because it's a common thing to say, well, Jesus was trying to hide his identity, and it definitely seems like that at some points. But then if you make that case, well, he's being very open about it in John. So is making that case in the synoptics create a contradiction between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and a contradiction with the Gospel of John? Do those three, are they in contradiction?
Right.
So
what do you think, Rob?
Well, they start off with this really easy straw man. Jesus never claimed to be God. He never called himself God anywhere in the Synoptic Gospels. Doesn't matter which source material in the Synoptics you're looking at it. He never says it. And he's saying it all over the place in the Gospel of John. And then actually the interviewer kind of walks him back a little bit on that and says, well, the argument actually is that Jesus didn't say, I'm God, but he said and did things that implied that he was God. And Ehrman says, well, that's more plausible, and I used to argue that way, but I don't anymore. Well, why didn't they start with that instead of the straw man position that nobody thinks is true? Jesus never calls himself God in any of the 4 Gospels, not even in John. Now, that's kind of surprising in a way, if John is, as Ehrman claims, a late fiction in which Jesus is made to say things in the gospel that he didn't really say, but that reflect John's view of Jesus. If that's true, and that's a very common view, it's not just Ehrman that takes that position, I find that a very surprising claim, because if that's true, you would expect the Gospel of John to represent Jesus saying, I'm God, because John says he is. You would expect if John thought Jesus was the Logos, or the Word, John 1:1, John 1:14, also in 1 John 1:1, if this is a title that John likes for Jesus, and he's just putting words in the mouth of Jesus that are fiction to describe his view of Jesus, why doesn't Jesus ever say, I am the Word, I'm the Logos? He never says that in the Gospel of John. Interestingly enough, Jesus' favorite title for himself, or maybe title isn't the right word, people argue about that, Jesus' favorite self-designation in the Gospel of John is the Son of Man, which is the same favorite self-designation we find in the Synoptic Gospels. And that self-designation, or later it could be regarded as a title, is essentially never used by the apostles and their associates when they're talking about Jesus in the New Testament. They don't say, I believe in the Son of Man. The Son of Man came for my sins. They don't use that kind of language. The only place the expression Son of Man comes up outside of sayings of Jesus is a couple of times in the Gospels, people are saying, what do you mean, Son of Man? Or in Revelation 1 and in Acts 7, when people had visions of one like a Son of Man or the Son of Man in heaven, alluding very clearly to Daniel 7. But they're not using Son of Man as a title of Jesus in their regular discourse, the way Christians use the title Son of God or Messiah or Lord. The gospel writers don't represent Jesus calling himself those things much at all. And in fact, what he likes to call himself in the third person, so he's doing it obliquely. He's not saying, I'm the Son of Man. He's referring to the Son of Man, and in context, you usually can tell he means himself. Who do you say that the Son of Man is?
Yeah. And we're going to get to that, I think, another issue.
It's talking about him.
Yeah.
So Jesus doesn't, in the Gospel of John, as in the Synoptics, Jesus does not use titles for himself just because the Gospel authors think of Jesus that way. They show a difference between the way Jesus talks about himself and the way the Gospel writers and the other New Testament authors talk about Jesus. So this claim that Jesus in the Gospel of John is made to claim divinity in a way that he doesn't in the Synoptics just isn't true. You have the same phenomenon in John that you have in Synoptics, which is Jesus will say things and people will go, huh? Who does this guy think he is? You're not even 50 years old. How could you have seen Abraham or Abraham seen you or any? They're always asking these kind of who are you questions, even in John. And yes, occasionally he says something that so clearly amounts to a claim to deity that they object, that they accuse him of blasphemy. That happens in Mark, which Ehrman says, and I agree, is the earliest of the four Gospels. It also happens in John. So there's really no significant difference here. All four Gospels present Jesus in various ways, making implicit claims to deity, sometimes very veiled, sometimes pretty obvious. And the reactions are similar in the Synoptics and in John.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's make sure it's clear for our viewers and for our listeners as well, is that while the skeptic might say that Jesus doesn't make overt statements to divinity in the Gospels, and therefore the way the commentary seems to, from the gospel writer, seems to suggest that he is divine, suggests that even they know he's not really claiming this, but they're trying to massage things to show this. You're saying, no. The point isn't that the gospel writers thought one thing that Jesus didn't think about himself, is that they used language. If they were going to be fabricators, if they were going to create this legend around Jesus and this false identity, so to speak, about Jesus, well, they would have put it on his lips because they're already, being accused of changing his words. But the point is that they don't use that language, even themselves. And if they did, they would have put it on Jesus's lips. So your point is that there's no real evidence of any kind of embellishment or fabrication on the gospel writer's part, because had that been the case, they would have been consistent and put those same words, their same theological views on Jesus's lips to give more authority to their own claims. But they don't do that, which suggests that there's an authenticity and a genuineness to the way they're expressing who Jesus thought he was.
It's actually kind of interesting in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus doesn't call himself the Son of God, but the demons do because they know who he is. And he's like, shh, be quiet. And at the very, other people don't get this for quite a long time in the Gospels. At the end of the Gospel of Mark, in Mark's presentation, the first human being to recognize that Jesus is the Son of God is the pagan centurion who's stationed at the cross, who's in charge of overseeing the execution of Jesus on the cross. And when Jesus dies, he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. And up to that point, no human being had really gotten a clear understanding of that or a recognition of that, even as far as the Gentile centurion might have had. They thought he was the Messiah if they believed in him, but they didn't really understand what was going on. And in the Gospel of John, the first person to acknowledge Jesus' deity overtly is Thomas, and that's after his resurrection. So there's a pattern here where there's a gradual disclosure of who Jesus is through his words and deeds, but it's never, flashed in front of people's faces in an overt way, and they have to learn by going through the story of themselves as participants, and come to that point of the crushing blow of the defeat at the cross, and then finding that Jesus was alive after his resurrection. I mean, it was just, it's hard for us 2,000 years later to put ourselves in their position. We can easily criticize disciples for being lunkheads, but would we have been any better?
Right.
Probably not.
Right. Yeah.
The Gospels give a very authentic account of the way Jesus interacted with people, both people who were trying to follow him and people who were opposed to him. And what the Gospels all show, is that Jesus gradually allowed his divine claims to become more clear and more closer to overt, to the point where, according to all three of the Synoptic Gospels, when Jesus was before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, Jesus' statement offended him as being a blasphemous claim, and they decided he was worthy of death. Well, what was the blasphemy? The blasphemy was that he was claiming divine prerogatives, divine privileges and authority and power, and they just, they couldn't have that. They couldn't stand for it. Well, he'd made statements like this before, but as it were, they had him on record now in an official meeting of the Sanhedrin, and so they could act on it, from their standpoint. And that's what they did. This raises another question, which I think you might want to talk about as we go along here, regarding why Jesus was put to death. And Ehrman had some things to say about that. So I don't want to jump the gun there, but we should talk about that if we have time, because it's a very serious misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's out on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, if I could just encapsulate that and summarize the answer you've already given a couple of times in different ways to the one question specifically, which is there a contradiction? Because John seems to be saying Jesus is God all over the place, but the Gospels are hiding it, so to speak. And so there's this contradiction in the life of Jesus. And your point is, no, they're both implying it. The language that's being used in John is of no real qualitative difference than the language in terms of the identification of Jesus as deity that you find in the Synoptics. So you don't see any kind of contradiction. You see a consistency between the Synoptics and the Gospel of John, right?
Yes. Now, if this would be an appropriate place, I would just like to tick off really quickly several ways in which the Gospel of Mark, again, which Ehrman says, and I agree, most biblical scholars agree, was the earliest of the Gospels to have been completed and written, that the Gospel of Mark shows Jesus' deity, again, without ever saying Jesus is God, doesn't use that phraseology, but ways in which the Gospel of Mark shows that Jesus is God. So I just want to tick off a few of these really quickly, kind of going in order as it comes up in Mark. He heals lepers directly and effortlessly without any religious ritual, without praying, without saying, God, please heal this man or anything like that. He just says, I'm willing to heal you, and he touches him and he's healed, There was a Jewish tradition based on Old Testament teaching that only God could heal a leper. There were other healings that could be done through prayer, but this one was beyond people. Only God could heal a leper. Then, in general, throughout the Gospel of Mark and in the other Gospels, Jesus heals people by his own word and touch, without praying, without asking God to do the healing, without religious ritual. He just heals them. Sometimes he heals them without saying anything. They touch him and they get healed. So he's healing people. Now, Jesus commissioned his disciples to heal people. You say, well, if they could heal people without being God, why couldn't Jesus? Here's the difference. The disciples healed people in Jesus' name.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would say, Jesus has authorized me on his behalf to say that you can be healed. The Father, Jesus doesn't talk about the Father authorizing him on this particular occasion. God has revealed to me that God wants to heal you. He just heals people, whenever they're brought to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Jesus heals people with an immediacy and effortlessness. Speaking of effortlessness, Jesus cast demons out of people the same way. And on one occasion, he cast out a group of demons from a man. The group of demons called themselves Legion, which meant there were thousands of them, perhaps, in this one man. And Jesus cast them out, boom, they were gone. Demons are powerful beings. Jesus is orders of magnitude more powerful than all those demons put together. Jesus forgives people's sins. We can talk about this more later if we have time. I'd love to talk about that. Ehrman talks about that, so we should. Jesus claims to be the Lord of the Sabbath. He calls us the Sea of Galilee in a big storm with just a sharp rebuke. Basically, he tells the storm to shut up. That's pretty much a good paraphrase of what Jesus said to the storm. And it just stopped. Very much calling to mind passages in the Psalms where God has the authority to calm the seas. Jesus feeds 5,000 men and their families with one boy's small lunch. This is what theologians call a nature miracle. Boy, is that a miracle. He walks on the Sea of Galilee in the night up to the disciples' boat. And that recalls passages in the book of Exodus and elsewhere about God on the sea with the Israelites. But on top of that, when Jesus gets to the boat, he says, "Fear not, I am." And that echoes the language of God in Isaiah 43 and elsewhere. That Jesus encourages his disciples to do things such as performing miracles and casting out demons, as I mentioned earlier, in his name, on his authority. Not, I do it on the Father's authority, and you can do it on the Father's authority as well. But no, they do it on his authority. And I'll mention just one more thing, and that is that on different occasions, Jesus claimed to be greater than the greatest things or beings that the Israelites or Jews knew of other than God himself. So he claimed to be greater than David, who was the greatest human king ever. He was David's Lord, he said. And Jesus claimed to be even greater than the angels. So who is this man who's making these outrageous claims for himself and doing it, by the way, in a manner that doesn't come across arrogant? In fact, he seems humble, but yet he says the most outrageous things.
Yeah.
So even in Mark, Jesus is revealing his divinity, his deity, without saying, I am God, or even I am the eternal Son of God, or anything like that. He lets his actions and along with his words, show people who have a willingness and an ability to hear who he actually is.
Rob, quick comment before we go to the next clip. Because what you've said is so powerful. As a lawyer, I can tell you one of my mentors told me that you don't win trials by telling the jury what the conclusion should be. You win a trial by showing the jury what the verdict should be. In other words, you let the evidence speak for itself. You show, don't tell. And what you're describing is not just Jesus saying some things that give import, theological weight to the things he's done, but he has shown, not just told. In other words, if he just ran around saying, I'm God, well, the pagans would have said, get in line. And if he had said, I'm Yahweh, then the people would have stood up and said, wait, hold on, we're going to stone you for blasphemy. But he didn't just say those things. He did it in a show kind of a way, like I'm going to prove it to you through the actions I do, and then I'm going to to couple that with the statements I'm making about who I really am. And so what you've helped us to see is really the best case making you can do, which is show, don't tell. You can tell and be superficial. And who knows if you're right. But if you show while you tell, that's a different thing. Now you only just told the narrative, but you've backed it up really, really well. So thanks for that, Rob. That's really, really, I think, valuable here as well. And especially the part, I love the part about how he commissions the disciples to go and do these miracles, but they're commissioned to do them in his name, which is not the kind of thing if you were just some guy who had authority from God you would do. You would never take that that kind of authority or mantle onto yourself unless you really believed you had that authority and mantle.
Well, hey, if you've been enjoying this conversation, and which how could you not? You've been getting like a seminary level education in just a few minutes here. Go ahead and subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications when new videos come out. We love having top-notch scholars like Dr. Rob Bowman with us, and we're going to have more conversations like this in the future. So help us get the word out to help correct some of the misunderstandings about Jesus that are floating around the culture. Whether you agree with us or not, we should all care about the truth. So help us by doing that, pass it along to your family and friends, and we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, hey, we're going to have to stop the episode there just for time's sake, and we want to keep going with the conversation. And in fact, we do keep going with the conversation, but it's a little more information. So if you're intrigued by this conversation, join us for part 2. But for right now, we're going to have to end this episode here and our conversation with Dr. Rob Bowman. But again, tune in a couple of weeks. You're going to hear the conclusion of our conversation. You won't want to miss it because some really great stuff. Dr. Ehrman responds to one of the apologetic responses, as it were, showing that in Mark chapter 2, Jesus is divine because he forgives sin. Well, Bart Ehrman says, not so fast. That doesn't prove anything. And Dr. Rob Bowman says, not so fast, not so fast. That actually does prove quite a bit. So you'll want to tune in for that. Ladies and gentlemen, as my closing argument here is just going to be a quick one because I close at the end of part 2. But stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, because the defense has not yet rested. But the reality is, the Bible says someone's case might sound convincing until another comes to challenge him. And Dr. Ehrman might have sounded convincing until I think someone with qualifications to Dr. Rob Bowman has come and challenged that conclusion that Jesus never claims to be God. The fact is, he claims to be God from Mark all the way through. There's no embellishment. He claims consistently and in the same manner to be God, not only on his own lips, but in such a way that impacted the gospel writers to believe that, in fact, he was who he claimed to be. So tune in for the next one. Until then, friends, the defense kind of rests.